Okay, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Okay, Saturday, August 6th, 1977. The dirt trail was narrow. Drooping boughs of tamarack, spruce, and pine scraped the roof and brushed the side windows of the Land Rover. Stop here, Rosner said tensely. Holbrook was driving. He was a big, stern-faced man in his early 30s. He gripped the wheel so tightly that his knuckles were bloodless. He braked, pulled the Rover to the right, and coasted in among the trees. He switched off the headlamps and turned on a dash light. Check your gun, Rosner said. Each man wore a shoulder holster that carried a Sig Petter, the finest automatic pistol in the world. Did I say that right, Petter? I don't know guns. But anyway,
Yeah, you
they,
did.
they pulled the magazines, checked for a full uh, com- complement of bullets, slammed the magazines back into the butts, and holstered the guns. Their movements seemed to be choreographed, as if they had practiced this 1,000 times. They got out and walked to the back of the car. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the Maine woods were ominously dark and still. Holbrook lowered the tailgate. A light winked on the inside of the Rover. He threw aside the tarpaulin, revealing two pairs of rubber hip boots, two flashlights, and other equipment. Rosner was shorter, slimmer, and quicker than Holbrook. He got his boots on first. Then he dragged the last two pieces of their gear from the car. The main component of each device was pressurized tank, much like the Aqualung cylinder, complete with shoulder straps and chest belt. A hose led from the tank to a stainless steel pin spray nozzle. They helped each other into the straps, made certain their shoulder holsters were accessible, and paced a bit to get accustomed to the weight of their backs. At 3:10, Rosner took a compass out of his pocket, studied it in his flashlight beam, put it away, and moved off into the forest. Holbrook followed, surprisingly quiet for such a large man. The land rose rather steeply. They had to stop twice in the next half hour to rest. At 3:40, they came within sight of the big Union sawmill. 300 yards to their right, a complex of 2 and 3-story clapboard and cinder block buildings rose out of the trees. Lights glowed at all the windows, and arc lamps bathed the fenced storage yard in fuzzy purplish white light. Within the huge main building, giant saws stuttered and whined continuously. Logs and cut planks toppled from conveyor belts and boomed when they landed in metal bins. Rosner and Holbrook circled around the mill to avoid being seen. They reached the top of the ridge at 4 o'clock. They had no difficulty locating the man-made lake. One end of it shimmered in the wan moonlight, and the other end was shadowed by a higher ridge that rose behind it. It was a neat oval, 300 yards long and 200 yards wide, fed by a gushing spring. It served as the reservoir for both the big Union Mill and the small town of Black River that lay 3 miles away through in the valley. They followed the 6-foot fence until they came to the main gate. The fence was there to keep out animals, and the gate was not even locked. They went inside. At the shadowed end of the reservoir, Rosner entered the water and walked about 10 feet before it rose nearly to the tops of his hip boots. The walls of the lake slanted sharply, and the depth at the center was 60 feet. He unraveled the hose from the storage reel on the side of the tank, grasped the steel tube at the end of it, and thumbed a button. A colorless, odorless chemical exploded from the nozzle. He thrust the end of the tube underwater and moved it back and forth, fanning the fluid as widely as possible. In 20 minutes, his tank was empty. He wound the hose around the reel and looked toward to the far end of the lake. Holbrook had finished emptying his tank and was climbing out onto the concrete apron. They met at the gate. Okay, Rosner asked. Perfect. By 5:10, they were back at the Land Rover. They got shovels from the back of the car and dug 2 shallow holes in the rich black earth. They buried the empty tanks, boots, holsters, and guns. For 2 hours, Holbrook drove along a series of rugged dirt trails, crossed St. John River on the timber ridge, picked up a gravel lane, and finally connected with a paved road at 8:30. From there, Rosner took the wheel. They didn't say more than a dozen words to each other. At 12:30, Holbrook got out of the Starlight Motel on Route 15, where he had a room. He closed the car door without saying goodbye, went inside, locked the motel door, and sat by the telephone. Rosner had the Rover's tank filled at a Sunoco station and picked up Interstate 95 south to Waterville and past Augusta. From there, he took the main turnpike to Portland, where he stopped at a service area and parked near a row of telephone booths. The afternoon sun made mirrors of the restaurant windows and flashed off the parked cars. Shimmering waves of hot air rose from the pavement. He looked at his watch, 3:35. He leaned back and closed his eyes. He appeared to be napping, but every 5 minutes he glanced at his watch. At 3:55, he got out of the car and went to the last booth in the row. At 4 o'clock, the phone rang. Rosner. The voice at the other end of the line was cold and sharp. "I am the key, Mr. Rosner." "I am the lock," Rosner said dully. "How did it go?" "As scheduled." "You missed the 3:30 call. Only by 5 minutes." The man at the other end hesitated. Then, "Leave the turnpike at the next exit. Turn right on the state route. Put the Rover up to at least 100 miles an hour. 2 miles long, the road takes a sudden turn, hard to the right. It's banked by a fieldstone wall. Do not apply your brakes when you reach the curve. Do not turn with the road. Drive straight into that wall and 100 miles an hour." Rosner stared through the glass wall of the booth. A young woman was crossing from the restaurant toward a little red sports car. She was wearing tight white shorts with dark stitching. She had nice legs. "Glenn?" "Yes, sir." "Do you understand me?" "Yes." "Repeat what I've said." Rosner went through it, almost word for word. "Very good, Glenn. Now go do it." "Yes, sir." Rosner returned to the Land Rover and drove back into the busy turnpike. Holbrook sat quietly, patiently in the unlighted motel room. He was switched on the television set, but he didn't watch it. He got up once to use the bathroom and to get a drink of water, but that was the only break in his vigil. At 4:10, the telephone rang. He picked it up. "Holbrook." "I am the key, Mr. Holbrook." I don't know why I keep saying doctor. "I am the lock." The man on the other end of the line spoke for half a minute. "Now repeat what I've said." Holbrook repeated it. "Excellent. Now do it." He hung up, went to the bathroom, and began to draw a tub full of warm water. When he turned right onto the state route, Glenn Rosner pressed the accelerator all the way to the floor. The engine roared. The car's frame began to shimmy. Trees and houses and other cars flashed past, mere blurs of color. The steering wheel jumped and vibrated in his hands. For the first mile and a half, he didn't look away from the road for even a second. When he saw the curve ahead, he glanced at the speedometer and saw that he was going slightly better than 100 miles per hour. He whimpered, but he didn't hear himself. The only things he could hear were the tortured noises produced by the car. At the last moment, he gritted his teeth and shuddered. The Land Rover hit the 4-foot-high stone wall so hard that the engine was jammed back into Rosner's lap. The car plowed part of the way through the wall. Stones shot up and rained back down. The Rover tipped onto its crushed front end, rolled over on its roof, slid across the ruined wall, and burst into flames. Holbrook undressed and climbed into the tub. He settled down in the water and picked up the single-edged razor blade that lay on the porcelain rim. He held the blade by the blunt end, firmly between the thumb and his first finger of his right hand. He then slashed open the veins in his left wrist. He tried to cut his right wrist. His left hand could not hold the blade. It slipped from his fingers. It plucked out from the darkening water, held it in his hand once more, and cut across the bridge of his left foot. Then he leaned back and closed his eyes. Slowly he drifted down a lightless tunnel of the mind into the ever-deepening darkness, getting dizzy and weak, feeling surprisingly little pain. In 30 minutes he was comatose. In 40 minutes he was dead. Sunday, August 7th, 1977. After working all week on the midnight shift, Buddy Pellinari was unable to change his sleeping habits for the weekend. At 4 o'clock Sunday morning, he was in the kitchen of his tiny 2-bedroom apartment. The radio, his most prized possession, he turned down low, music from an all-night Canadian station. He was sitting at the table, next to the window, staring fixedly at the shadows on the far side of the street. He had seen a cat running across the walk over there, and the hairs had stood on the back of his neck. There were two things that Buddy Pillinari hated and feared more than all else in life: cats and ridicule. For 25 years he had lived with his mother, and for 20 years she had kept a cat in the house. First Caesar, and then Caesar the Second. She had never realized that the cats were quicker and far more cunning than her son, and therefore a bane to him. Caesar, first or second, it made no difference, liked to lie quietly atop bookshelves and cupboards and highboys until Buddy walked past. Then he'd leap on Buddy's back. The cat never scratched him badly. For the most part, it was concerned with getting a good grip on his shirt so that he could not shake it loose. Every time, as if following a script, Buddy would panic and run in circles or dart from room to room in search of his mother, with Caesar spitting in his ear. He never suffered much pain from the game, but the suddenness of the attack, the surprise of it, that terrified him. His mother said Caesar was only being playful. At times he had confronted the cat to prove he was unafraid. He approached it as it sunned on a window sill and tried to stare it down, but he was always the first to look away. He couldn't understand people all that well, and the alien gaze of the cat made him feel especially stupid and inferior. He was able to deal with ridicule more easily than he could deal with cats, if only because it ever came as a surprise. When he was a boy, other children had teased him mercilessly. He had learned to prepare for it, learned how to endure it. Buddy was bright enough to know that he was different from others. If his intelligent quotient had been several points lower, he wouldn't have known enough to be ashamed of himself, which was what people expected of him. If his IQ had been a few points higher, he would have been able to cope, at least to some extent, with both cats and cruel people. Because he fell in between, his life was lived as an apology for his stunted intellect, a curse he bore as a result of malfunctioning hospital incubator where he had been placed after being born 5 weeks prematurely. His dad had died in a mill accident when Buddy was 5, and the first Caesar had entered the house 2 weeks later. If his father hadn't died, perhaps there would have been no cats, and Buddy liked to think that, with his father alive, no one would dare ridicule him. Ever since his mother had succumbed to cancer 10 years ago when he was 25, Buddy had worked as an assistant night watchman at the Big Union Supply Company mill. If he suspected that certain people at Big Union felt responsible for him, that his job was make work, he had never admitted it, not even to himself. He was on duty from midnight to 8, 5 nights a week, patrolling the storage yards, looking for smoke, sparks, and flames. He was proud of his position. In the last 10 years, he had come to enjoy a measure of self-respect that would have been inconceivable before he had even been hired. Yet there were times when he felt like a child again, humiliated by other children, the brunt of a joke he could never understand. His boss at the mill, Ed McGrady, the chief watchman on the graveyard shift, was a pleasant man. He was incapable of hurting anyone. However, he smiled when others did the teasing. Ed always told them to stop, always rescued his friend Buddy, but he always got a laugh from it. That was why Buddy hadn't told anyone what he had seen Saturday morning, nearly 20 hours ago. He didn't want them to laugh. Around that time, he left the storage yard and walked well off into the trees to relieve himself. He avoided the lavatory whenever he could because it was there for the other men. There, the other men teased him the most and showed him the least mercy. At 4:45, he was standing by a big pine tree, shrouded in darkness, taking a pee, when he saw 2 men coming down from the reservoir. They carried hooded flashlights and cast narrow yellow beams. In the backwash of the lights, as the men passed within 5 yards of him, Buddy saw they were wearing rubber hip boots, as if they had been fishing. They couldn't fish in the reservoir, could they? There was no fish up there. Another thing, each man wore a tank on his back, like skin divers wore on television, and they were carrying guns in their shoulder holsters. They looked out of a place in the woods, so strange. They frightened him. He sensed they were killers, like on the television. If they knew he had been seen, they would kill him and bury him out there. He was sure of it. But then Buddy was always expected the worst. Life had taught him to think that way. He stood perfectly still, watched them until they were out of sight, and ran back to the storage yard. But he quickly realized he couldn't tell anyone what he had seen. They wouldn't believe him. And by God, if he was going to be ridiculed for telling what was only the truth, then he would keep it secret. Just the same as he wished he could tell someone, if not the watchman at the mill. He thought and thought about it, but still could not make sense of the skin divers or whatever they were. In fact, the more he thought about it, the more bizarre it seemed. He was frightened by what he could not understand. He was certain that if he told someone, it could be explained to him. Then he wouldn't be afraid. But if they laughed, well, he didn't understand their laughter either. But that was even more frightening than the mystery men in the woods. On the far side of the main street, as the cat scampered from the high purple shadows and ran east towards Edison's general store, startling Buddy out of his reverie. He pressed against the window pane and watched the cat as it turned around the corner, afraid that it would try to sneak back and climb up into the third floor rooms. He kept a watch on the place where it had vanished. For a moment, he had forgotten the men in the woods because his fear of cats was far greater than his fear of guns and strangers. And then the next one is Conspiracy, and it starts on Saturday, August 13th, 1977. Do y'all want me to read that chapter, or do y'all want me to stop there and talk about what we just read?
We could discuss it.
Okay, so at the beginning of the book, it seems like there's these two guys that take some kind of chemical and run it out to this part of the woods behind a mill where Buddy works. The main guy, I guess, is what he's going to be. And they put this chemical into the water, and then they got a phone call from this guy with instructions to kill themselves afterwards. So one dude drove his car into a brick wall at 100 miles an hour and killed himself that way. Car blew up. And then the other guy went into the bathtub and slit his wrist and his foot and let himself die slowly in the bathtub. But they were instructed to do that after they put the chemicals in the water.
Yeah, that's crazy.
It's pretty intense.
And Buddy's afraid of cats. For whatever reason, they felt the need to put that in the book. He's afraid of cats. So,
Let me just to clarify: is Buddy's the guy that he's like the main character, I guess?
I'm guessing so. They were talking about how he works at the mill and he doesn't seem to get
Right.
along with anyone at work. Like his boss is nice to him, but even his boss will laugh and kind of giggle with the people that are making fun of him at work. Nobody takes him seriously. So he's afraid to tell people what he saw because he saw them going into the woods and doing that, but he didn't know what to think of it and he didn't want to tell anyone about it because he didn't think they would believe him or they would make fun of him for it.
Right, right. And then what was going on with those two guys that were like fishing? Was that separate?
No. He said he thought they might have been fishing because they had skin suits on
Oh, I
and
see.
water.
Okay, I see.
So
Alright.
he wasn't sure what they were doing. He wasn't sure what they were doing, but we know that they were putting chemicals in the water.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
When you say they were putting chemicals in the water, was it like they're talking about like a lake or something like that? They're putting chemicals in there?
yeah, they were putting it in a lake behind the mill, and it said it was odorless and colorless.
Oh shit! I don't know. Maybe that's like drinking water or something like that that goes to people's tap or something like that. It's possible.
Yeah, maybe because it's behind a mill. I don't know what kind of mill it is. It didn't
Right.
specify,
But it just seems
but
like that's kind of a um, kind of like
I'm sure people swim in
giving
the
like
lake. So
right. Yeah. Maybe the chemical has something to do with that. That's in that water.
what I think what this book
That's
is going to be about is somehow people ingest this water and it makes them go crazy.
Right.
That's
That's
what
what
I
I was
think.
thinking.
that's what I was thinking too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or even just swimming in it, it gets into your skin and your eyes and shit like that, and
Mm-hmm.
just gets into your body somehow.
Yeah, it seems like it's a pretty small town. Like maybe everybody knows everybody. And
Right.
plus, this book is in 1977, so people are more social back then
Right. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
a lot
No,
more
there's
outdoor
no
activities.
exactly. Yeah. No one's like cooped up at home playing video games and shit like that. No, that makes sense.
Yeah.
No.
Right. Right. That's pretty interesting. It's a thinker for sure.
Yeah. Do y'all want me to read another chapter, or do y'all want to end it on that and then start the next one? This next chapter is 3 pages long.
How long is that?
Well, I just read 12 pages. So,
It's up to you guys.
Don't matter to me. I got nothing going on.
Same.
well, this chapter is actually it's the first chapter of the book. That was just the introduction. That's just kind of setting the scene for you.
Oh, I see. So then,
Uh,
So then we'll just maybe just go through this, and then after this, then like maybe we can stop. I'm
right?
assuming.
Yeah, that way,
Yeah.
it kind of leave us on a little cliffhanger, and then we can kind of recap from there. Sure. Yeah, go ahead and read it. Go back to mute.
When he drove around the curve into the small valley, Paul and Annandale felt a change come over him. After 5 hours behind the wheel yesterday and 5 more today, he was weary and tense. But suddenly his neck stopped aching and his shoulders unknotted. He felt at peace, as if nothing could go wrong in this place. As if he were Hugh Conaway in Last Horizon and had just entered Shangri-La. Of course, Black River was not Shangri-La by any stretch of the imagination. It existed and maintained its population of 400 solely as an adjunct of the mill. For a company town, it was quite clean and attractive. The main street was lined with tall oak and birch trees. The houses were New England colonials, white frame, and brick salt boxes. Paul supposed he responded to it so positively because he had no bad memories to associate with it, only good ones, and that could not be said of many places in a man's life. There's Edison's store. There's Edison's. Mark Annandale leaned over from the back seat, pointing through the windshield, smiling, and Paul said, "Thank you, Coonskin Pete, scout of the North." Raya was as excited as her brother, for Sam Edison was like a grandfather to them, but she was more dignified than Mark. At 11, she yearned for the womanhood that was still years ahead of her. She sat up straight in her safety harness beside Paul in the front seat. She said, "Mark, sometimes I think you're 5 years old instead of 9. Oh, yeah? Well, sometimes I think you're 60 instead of 11. Touche, Paul said. Mark grinned. Usually he was no match for his sister. This sort of quick response was not his style. Paul glanced sideways at Raya and saw that she was blushing. He winked to let her know he wasn't laughing at her. Smiling, sure of herself again, she settled back into her seat. She could have topped Mark's line with a better one and left him mumbling. But she was capable of generosity, and not a particularly common quality in children her age. The instant the station wagon stopped at the curb, Mark was out on the pavement. He bounded up the 3 concrete steps, raced across the wide-roofed veranda, and disappeared into the store. The screen door slammed shut behind him as Paul switched off the engine. Raya was determined not to make a spectacle of herself, as Mark had done. She took her time getting out of the car, stretched and yawned, smoothed the knees of her jeans, straightened the collar of her dark blue blouse, patted her long brown hair, closed the car door, and went up the steps. By the time she reached the porch, however, she had begun to run. Edison's General Store was an entire shopping center in 3,000 square feet. There was one room, 100 feet long and 30 feet wide, with an ancient pegged pine floor. The east end of the store was a grocery. The west end held dry goods and sundries, as well as a gleaming modern drug counter. As his father had been before him, Sam Edison was the town's only licensed pharmacist. In the center of the room, 3 tables and 12 oak chairs were grouped in front of a wood-burning county stove. Ordinarily, you would find elderly men playing cards at one of those tables, but at the moment the chairs were empty. Edison's store was not just a grocery and pharmacy. It was also Black River's community center. Paul opened the heavy lid on the soda cooler and plucked a bottle of Pepsi from the icy water. He sat down at one of the tables. Raya and Mark were standing at an old-fashioned glass-fronted candy counter, giggling at one of Sam's jokes. He gave them sweets and sent them to the paperback and comic book racks to choose presents for themselves. Then he came over and sat with his back to the cold stove. They shook hands across the table. At a glance, Paul thought Sam looked hard and mean. He was very solidly built, 5'8", 160 pounds, broad in the chest and shoulders. His short-sleeved shirt revealed powerful forearms and biceps. His face tanned and creased, and his eyes were like chips of gravy, chips of gray slate. Even with his thick white hair and beard, he looked more dangerous than grandfatherly, and he could have passed as a decade younger than his 55 years. But that forbidding exterior was misleading. He was a warm and gentle man, a pushover for children. Most likely, he gave away more candy than he sold. Paul had never seen him angry and had never heard him raise his voice. When did you get in town? This is our first stop. You didn't say in your letter how long you'd be staying this year. 4 weeks? 6, I think. Wonderful. His gray eyes glimmered merrily. But that craggy face, the expression might have appeared to be malice to anyone who didn't know him well. You're staying the night with us as planned? You aren't going up into the mountains today? Paul shook his head no. Tomorrow will be soon enough. We've been on the road since 9 this morning. I don't have strength to pitch camp this afternoon. You're looking good, though. I'm feeling good now that I'm in Black River. Needed this vacation, didn't you? God, yes. Paul drank some of the Pepsi. I'm sick to death of these hypertense poodles and Siamese cats with ringworms. Sam smiled. I told you 100 times, haven't I? You can't expect to be an honest veterinarian when you set up shop in the suburbs of Boston. Down there, you're a nursemaid for neurotic house pets and in their neurotic owners. Get out into the country, Paul. You mean I ought to involve myself with cows calving and mares foaling? Exactly. Paul sighed. Maybe I will one day. You should get those kids out of the suburbs, out where the air is clean and the water's drinkable. Maybe I will. He looked towards the rear of the store, towards a curtained doorway. Is Jenny here? I spent all morning filling prescriptions, and now she's out delivering them. I think I've sold more drugs in the past 4 days than I usually sell in 4 weeks. Epidemic? Yeah, flu, gripe, whatever you want to call it. What does Dr. Troutman call it? Sam shrugged. He's not really sure. Some new breed of the flu, he thinks. What's he prescribing? A general-purpose antibiotic. Tetracycline. That's not particularly strong. Yes, but this flu isn't all that devastating. Is the tetracycline helping? It's too soon to tell. Paul glanced at Rye and Mark. They're safer here than anywhere else in town, Sam said. Jenny and I are about the only people in Black River who haven't come down with it. If I come up there in the mountains and I found I've got 2 sick kids on my hand, what should I expect? Nausea? Fever? None of that. Just night chills. Paul tilted his head quizzingly. Damn scary, as I understand it. Sam's eyebrows drew together in one bushy white bar. You wake up in the middle of the night, as if you've just had a terrible dream. You shake so hard you can't hold on to anything. You can barely walk. Your heart is racing, you're pouring sweat, and I mean sweating pints. Like you've got awfully high blood pressure. It lasts as much as an hour, and then it goes away as if it never was. Leaves you weak most the next day. Frowning, Paul said, that doesn't sound like the flu. It doesn't sound like much of anything, but it scares the hell out of people. Some of them got sick Tuesday night, and most of the others joined in on Wednesday. Every night they wake up shaking, and every day they're weak, a bit tired. Damned few people around here have a good night's sleep this week. Has Doc Troutman gotten a second opinion on any of these cases? Nearest other doctor is 60 miles away, Sam said. He did call the state health authority yesterday afternoon and asked for one of their field men to come up here and have a look, but they haven't sent anyone until Monday. I guess they can't get very excited about an epidemic of night chills. The chills could be the tip of an iceberg. Could be. But you know, bureaucrats. When he saw Paul glance at Raya and Mark again, Sam said, Look, don't worry about it. We'll keep the kids away from everyone who's sick. I was supposed to take Jenny up the street to Altman's Cafe. We were going to have a nice quiet dinner together. If you catch the flu from a waitress or another customer, you'll pass it to the kids. Skip the cafe. Have dinner here. You know I'm the best cook in Black River. Paul hesitated. Laughing softly, stroking his beard with one hand, Sam said, Well, we'll have an early dinner, 6 o'clock. That'll give you and Jenny plenty of time together. You can go for a ride later or keep myself and the kids out of the den if you'd rather just stay home. Paul smiled. What's on the menu? Manicotti. Who needs Altman's Cafe? Sam nodded in agreement. Only the Altmans. Raya and Mark hurried over to get Sam's approval of the gifts they had chosen for themselves. Mark had $2 worth of comic books, and Raya had 2 paperbacks. Each of them had small bags of candy. Raya's blue eyes seemed especially bright to Paul, as if there were lights behind them. She grinned and said, "Daddy, this is going to be the best vacation we've ever had." So, it introduced a family. Seems like a dad and his two